My name is Fiona Mercer. I'm 32, and I work the night shift at a wildlife rehabilitation sanctuary in the dense, rainy forests of Olympia, Washington. Month. My mother sold my late grandfather's 1938 black-enamel Leica camera, the one promised to me since I was 9 years old, to pay for my brother's luxury wellness retreat and brand launch in Costa Rica. When I asked her why she did it, she didn't look up from her cutting board. She wiped her hands on a grease-stained paper towel, tossed it in the bin, and said he needed the breakthrough more than I needed a relic. I didn't scream. I didn't start a shouting match in her kitchen. Instead, I spent the next 3 weeks tracking that camera through specialty vintage shops, online collector forums, and local estate dealers. And what I did when I finally recovered it made our family group chat, all 23 of them, go completely silent for 9 full minutes. Then my phone started vibrating 9 times in a single hour. But here is what none of them knew about those 3 weeks. Welcome back to their secret stories. This is the space where quiet women finally decide to get loud. These are stories about family betrayal, and the exact moment keeping the peace is no longer worth the cost. If this is your kind of story, drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're listening from, and what time it is where you are, and make sure to subscribe. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. 9 years of working night shifts in a wildlife sanctuary teach you 2 things: coffee is an essential food group, and silence always comes with a bill. You just don't get the invoice right away. I've worked the graveyard shift at the Cascade Sanctuary for nearly a decade. The hours where the critical, injured animals need feeding every 2 hours, the shift nobody wants and someone has to cover. I bought my own place in 2018, a small, weathered cedar cabin tucked in the woods with a gravel driveway that washes out every winter. I shovel my own snow. I patch my own roof. And in my family, that quiet independence earned me a very specific, unspoken title: the one who handles things. When my mother's well pump failed in the dead of November, I was the one who paid the $4,000 emergency replacement fee at dawn, straight after a 12-hour shift. When my brother Julian totaled his pickup, I spent a month driving him to his freelance gigs on my only days off, both ways. When grandfather Arthur got sick, I was the one who managed the estate paperwork, who sat in sterile living rooms with cold tea, who learned how to navigate the complex probate laws and wished I hadn't. Nobody asked me to do any of it. That is the silent trap of being the reliable one. Nobody ever has to ask. They simply assume, and you deliver. Over time, the assuming and the delivering start to look so much like love that you stop checking if anyone would ever do the same for you. My mother had a phrase for me, and she delivered it like a compliment every single time. Fiona doesn't need anything. She said it at Thanksgiving, at summer barbecues, at family reunions. Fiona doesn't need anything. It took me over 30 years and an empty leather case to understand what that sentence actually meant. In our family, being strong is a full-time, unpaid job, and the benefits were being stripped away the entire time. The camera was a 1938 Leica Thug, a mechanical masterpiece with brass showing through the worn black paint finish, and a lens that had captured 3 decades of local history. My grandfather had purchased it after working the brutal timberlines of the Pacific Northwest. When he finally brought it home, he told my grandmother the camera had seen more of the wilderness than he ever would. He retold that story every winter. I first heard it when I was 9, sitting beside him on a mossy cedar log in an autumn rain that smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. That was the day he hung the heavy strap around my neck and said, "This will be yours one day, Fee. I've already decided." A promise made to a 9-year-old is a small thing to everyone except the child who receives it. I carried that promise for over 20 years. And here is the crucial part. It wasn't just a woods promise. When grandfather passed away 20 months ago, his legal will stated it clearly. The 1938 Leica camera and its original lenses to my granddaughter, Fiona Elizabeth Mercer. Black ink notarized filed. My mother was named the executor of the estate, and the camera was placed in the locked glass cabinet in her study for safekeeping. I asked twice to bring it to my cabin. Both times, my mother patted my arm with that patronizing warmth. "It's much safer here, sweetie. Your cabin is so close to the damp woods. The lenses will grow mold." I remember standing in her study, thinking that wasn't a real reason. I remember choosing not to push, because pushing in our family was a trait reserved only for the selfish. So the camera stayed in the glass cabinet, or at least, that's where we all believed it was, right up until a Sunday dinner when my brother started talking about high-frequency healing retreats, and a muscle in my mother's jaw twitched a fraction of a second too fast. Sunday dinners at my mother's house always followed an unwritten script: baked salmon, wild rice, and my mother refusing any help in the kitchen only to complain later that she did everything herself. That particular Sunday, Julian arrived practically glowing, his phone active as he swiped through photos of a luxury eco lodge in Costa Rica, infinity pools, yoga decks, and a private villa. He was launching a luxury lifestyle brand and wanted to spend a month aligning his energy. Julian is 30, and he can make a mundane Tuesday feel like a festival. Honestly, I used to love that about him. The same way you appreciate a rare butterfly that has never once had to think about where its shelter comes from. I asked the obvious question, keeping my tone light as I passed the salad. "Costa Rica for a month. Did you get a major investor for the startup?" Julian laughed. My mother did not. My mother stood up abruptly and began clearing plates that still had food on them. "It's taken care of," Julian said, breezy and unbothered. "Mom invested in my vision. She knows I've had such a grueling year with my mental health and the business launch." A grueling year. Julian's grueling year involved a failed podcast and a lease he broke because the landlord wouldn't allow his emotional support dog. My grueling year involved feeding orphaned fawns at 4 a.m. in freezing rain and holding animals while they were put to sleep. But I didn't say that. Instead, I remarked that it was incredibly generous of Mom. I watched my mother's back as she stood at the sink, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she scrubbed the same pot 3 times. Night shifts in the sanctuary give you a sixth sense for the moment before an animal turns, a subtle stillness the body assumes right before it lashes out. My mother's shoulders had that exact stillness. Nobody else at the table noticed. The chatter drifted to packing lists and meditation schedules. I ate my dinner in silence, a cold, quiet part of my brain starting to do math I didn't want to calculate. After dinner, I went into her study. I wasn't snooping. Grandfather's birthday was approaching, and I wanted to find his old field journal, specifically the sketch of the old growth trail, because I'd promised my cousin Toby a photo of it for a forestry mapping project he was working on. The heavy glass door of the study cabinet opened with a soft, familiar click. Inside were the old journals, the leather-bound books, and the velvet camera case sitting exactly where it always had. I don't know why I opened it. I'd like to say it was pure intuition, but the truth is simpler. I wanted to touch it. I wanted 30 seconds with the one beautiful thing in that house that actually belonged to me. The case was empty, not misplaced, not tilted. Empty, with the velvet padding pressed completely flat. I carried the empty leather case downstairs the way you carry a critical diagnostic report to a supervisor. My mother was still at the sink. I said, "Mom, where is grandfather's Leica?" And my mother. I want you to hear this part exactly as it happened. Did not flinch. She didn't hesitate or search for a gentle way to break the news. She simply wiped her hands on the paper towel, tossed it, and said, "I sold it, sweetie." Julian needed the seed money. In over 30 years of Sunday dinners, I had never heard that kitchen so quiet. Somewhere behind me, the refrigerator hummed. My mother turned back to the sink and resumed washing as if she had just told me there was a chance of rain tomorrow. I stood there holding the empty leather case, realizing with a chilling clarity that the Costa Rican retreat had already been paid for in full. I placed the case on the counter between us like physical evidence. "That camera was left to me in the will, Mom. You were the executor. You signed the legal paperwork." She let out the long, weary sigh she usually reserved for difficult children. It was sitting in a dark cabinet, Fiona, doing absolutely nothing. Your brother was spiraling. You have your cabin, your stable state job, your savings. You have never once needed a single thing. There it was again, my stability used as the justification for my own robbery. She kept going, her defense ready, spoken with the absolute conviction of someone who had never had to question her own narrative. Family things belong to the family. An old camera helps no one. Julian was in a dark place. Did you want your brother to fail? And besides, she added with a sickening note of pride, I got an excellent price for it. 3,400. The retreat was only 3,100 Dao. She quoted the figures like she was proud of finding a sale. 3,400 for a rare vintage Leica appraised at more than double that amount. But I didn't know that part yet. What I did know was that my phone was buzzing in my pocket right then. A text from Julian, already at the departure gate, holding a green smoothie. The caption ready, "Manifesting abundance in the jungle. Keep grinding, sis." He didn't know, or he had chosen not to ask, which, in our family, is a highly refined way of knowing without the burden of guilt. I looked at my mother, 61 years old, a retired administrative assistant who had spent 3 decades keeping files in perfect order, and who had somehow managed to completely miscalculate whose asset this actually was. "You felt very maternal, didn't you?" I asked. She smiled, visibly relieved. "Exactly, dear. I'm glad you understand." That was the exact second I stopped arguing. Arguing is for people who believe they are experiencing a simple misunderstanding. Let me tell you about grandfather Arthur. When he was 84, he had a brief window where his health stabilized enough to give us one last beautiful autumn. He used that season to teach me how to identify tracking paths in the snow, because he said my mother walked the trails too fast and Julian couldn't stay quiet long enough to observe. Saturday mornings in the woods, the rain pattering on our hoods, his warm hands guiding mine to point out a print. "The forest always leaves a record, Fiona," he'd say. "You've got those steady, patient eyes, perfect for tracking." That fall, he talked more than he ever had about his past, about the timber lines, about being a young surveyor who knew how to make a single bag of flour last a month. One morning, his wet coat still dripping, he looked at me with a sudden, sharp intensity. "You're the quiet one, Fiona," he said softly. "But quiet is not the same as gone. You remember that?" I said. "Okay." "Grandpa, the way you agree with the elderly when you foolishly believe you have all the time in the world to understand them later." Before the first freeze, he pressed an old hollowed-out book into my hands, heavy leather bound, filled with notes written in his elegant cursive, and told me it was mine now, warning me never to let anyone offer it to me twice. I placed it on my cabin shelf, believing the tracking notes were the real inheritance. He passed away the following spring, and I am going to tell you now what I didn't discover until the most painful week of this entire ordeal. My grandfather, who counted every cent and trusted my mother with almost everything, had slipped something flat and official behind the notes, wedged between the pages of his old diary. I didn't know it yet, standing in my mother's kitchen holding that empty case. But my grandfather had left me far more than a promise. He had left me proof. The following Monday, after my shift ended, I drove 20 minutes back to my mother's house and asked for one basic detail, the name of the shop where she sold it. She was working on a puzzle at the dining table and didn't even look up. I don't recall. Fiona, an incredibly convenient lapse of memory for a woman who could recall a tracking number from memory. I asked again, keeping my voice gentle, the way I would ask an injured animal to trust me. She laid her pen down. What are you planning to do? Try to buy it back. Create some dramatic scene. It's over. Don't turn this into a massive production. A production. I had worked through holidays, attended 2 family funerals, and managed countless domestic crises without ever causing a ripple. Yet, the very first time I asked to be treated fairly, I was accused of being dramatic. I kept my voice entirely level. It wasn't yours to sell, Mom. That's the reality. I want to know where it went. And then she uttered the phrase that changed the entire trajectory of my search. She waved her hand dismissively, returning to her puzzle. Oh, for heaven's sake, it's what you do for family. I've handled things this way before. I stood perfectly still in the doorway. You've done what before? Her mouth snapped shut. Her pen went back to the paper. It's just an expression, she muttered. But it wasn't, and we both knew it wasn't, because my mother does not speak in expressions. She speaks in precedents. I let it drop outwardly, inwardly. I tucked that sentence away alongside the empty case and the folded paper towel. I've done it before. On my drive home, at every red light, the words echoed in my mind. Before what? To whom? It would take me 3 weeks to find the answer, in a file she handed to me herself. I texted Julian that night on his second day in Costa Rica, because whatever my brother's faults, he is not my mother. I wanted to believe that distinction mattered. I kept it strictly factual. Mom sold grandfather's Leica camera to pay for your retreat, the one legally left to me in the will. Did you know about this? The typing bubbles appeared, vanished, and reappeared for several agonizing minutes. A hesitation that told me more than his actual words ever could. Finally, OMG. Fiona, I had absolutely no idea it was that specific camera. Mom told me she was selling some old equipment of grandfather's that was just sitting around. I swear I will pay you back every single dollar. I promise. Read that carefully. She didn't know it was that specific camera. Meaning he knew an heirloom was being liquidated. He knew grandfather's legacy was being converted into travel credit. The question he chose not to ask was which piece and whose. In my family, our primary skill is not active cruelty. Cruelty requires conscious effort. Our specialty is the art of not asking. Not asking is completely free, and the returns are incredibly convenient. I sat at my kitchen table that night and did the math, because numbers do not lie even when family does. The camera sold for $3,400. The trip cost $3,100. That left a $300 discrepancy. I am embarrassed by how long I stared at that gap, as if solving the mystery of the missing $300 would somehow justify the theft of the $3,100. I found the answer 2 weeks later entirely by accident. Sitting on my mother's kitchen counter was a brand new, high-end copper cookware set, still in its pristine packaging. Apparently, my grandfather's Leica had covered the jungle getaway, with just enough left over for my mother's kitchen upgrade. Julian never brought up the subject of paying me back again. The organic meals in the jungle, I imagine, were spectacular. I stopped texting and began compiling a comprehensive list of every antique shop, vintage camera dealer, and pawnbroker within a 30-mile radius. Before we get into the details of the search, let me pause for a moment. If you have ever been the reliable one in your family, the one they call at 2 in the morning but forget to invite at 2 in the afternoon, tell me in the comments what they took from you. Because I've learned there is always a cost, and I read every single story. The list contained 24 locations. I work 3 12-hour shifts a week, which gave me 4 days to hunt. I treated it like a tracking pathy, specialty camera shops first, antique dealers second, pawn brokers dead last. Because the thought of that lens being separated from its body was something I couldn't let myself contemplate. I called 13 shops during my breaks, standing near the sanctuary gates with my collar turned up against the cold wind. I described the camera with clinical precision 1938 black, paint Leica Auge camera. Brass showing through with a vintage lens likely brought in by a woman in her early 60s about 4 weeks ago. 12 rejections. Some were sympathetic. Some were indifferent, and one tried to sell me a completely different vintage camera. It was the 13th call, a boutique named Rainier Vintage and Optical on Harrison Street, where the silence occurred. In my line of work, you learn to read silences. There is the silence of a person looking through a physical catalog, and there is the silence of a person realizing they are holding something they shouldn't. This was the latter. The gentleman on the line spoke in a measured, careful tone. "We process quite a few vintage camera acquisitions, ma'am." I couldn't say over the phone. I told him I understood. "You would need to come in," he said, choosing his words like stepping stones across thin ice. I hung up, caught my reflection in the glass doors of the sanctuary lobby, and whispered to myself, "We found it." By Thursday, the family was fully aware of my search. Because my mother had done what she always does, established her narrative first. Our group chat has 23 participants, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a retired neighbor who was added years ago and never left. The unofficial mediator of the chat is my Aunt Meredith, my mother's younger sister, a woman who has styled herself as the diplomat of a conflict she pretends isn't happening. The messages began rolling in like a slow-moving storm. "Fiona, sweetie. Cameras can be replaced, mothers cannot." That was Meredith, then an uncle. "Your grandfather would be heartbroken to see this family fracturing over material things." Over material things. Then Meredith again, using phrasing that had clearly been dictated by my mother. "She needed it more, Fiona. Julian has had such a devastating year. Just let it go." There is a profound, isolating loneliness in watching 23 people. People you have driven to doctor appointments, helped move, and sat within hospital corridors, collectively agree that the theft of the only thing you ever cherished is simply a behavioral issue on your part. Nobody asked if I was doing okay. Nobody asked what the legal will actually said. The will carried zero weight in that chat, just as the camera had carried zero weight sitting in that study. I didn't reply to any of them. I had learned that specific brand of silence from my mother, using it as a vault to store things away. But late that night, my screen lit up with a private message from my cousin Toby, Aunt Meredith's youngest son, the history buff, the one who had sat silently beside me at grandfather's memorial service while everyone else crowded the food table. His message read, "They did the same thing to my dad's vintage fly, fishing gear when I was in school. Nobody ever apologized to him either. Whatever you are planning to do, do it. Don't look back. It is a beautiful thing, courage. Sometimes it arrives in a single sentence from the quietest corner of the room. Rainier Vintage and Optical smelled of machine oil and old leather. The man behind the glass counter matched the aesthetic perfectly. Early 60s. Gold-rimmed glasses on a chain, the deliberate care that comes from a lifetime of handling other families' histories. Silas Ward. I provided the description again. In person. I also placed my grandfather's memorial card on the counter. It wasn't a tactical move, or perhaps it was. He stared at the card for a long moment. Then he stepped into the back room and emerged with a heavy leather, bound ledger. He opened it, turning the pages toward me, his finger resting on a specific line. Consignment intake 5 weeks ago, 1938 black paint Leica the fridge camera, original lens, consignor Helena Mercer, And there it was, my mother's elegant, unmistakable signature, the same hand that had signed my report cards and permission slips, signing away the one thing my grandfather had specifically put my name on. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for weeks. I want to be entirely honest about what it felt like. It wasn't a sudden wave of anger. It was the heavy, sinking sensation you get when an X-ray confirms the exact fracture you had already diagnosed by touch. It was the feeling of being entirely correct, which is a far lonelier feeling than people realize. Is it still here? I asked. Silas Ward slowly removed his glasses, and I knew the answer before he even spoke. You learn to read the signs from a physician's gate as they walk down the hall. Mom, I am truly sorry, he said gently. The piece was purchased last Tuesday. The ground did not shake. The world kept spinning. I asked the only remaining question, sold to whom? Silas Ward. A decent man burdened with delivering terrible news folded his glasses. I cannot legally disclose that information, not without an official police report. And I assume you don't wish to go that route. I drove home from Rainier Vintage with a plan that consisted of a single objective. Find absolute proof of the camera's details, proof of ownership, proof of value. I pulled the old family photo albums from my shelf. I found Christmas 1997. My grandfather's hand resting on the table, the camera catching the camera flash. It was clear, but not legally sufficient. And then I remembered the hollowed-out book. I want you to understand that I was originally searching for an old photo of him and Grandma at the lake that he used to keep tucked in there. What I found instead was filed behind the tracking notes, wedged between the pages of his old diary. Flat, yellowed, and folded once. An appraisal certificate from Seattle Fine Optical dated 1905-1938 black paint Leica Fig camera original lens, full structural details and measurements. There was a tiny hand-drawn diagram of the lens, its natural inclusions mapped out like a miniature constellation. Appraised value $8,500. Owner Arthur Mercer. I sat on my kitchen floor, my back supported by the cabinets, and held that yellowed card for a long time. Two distinct realizations arrived at once, like a passenger carpooling with bad news. The first was pure arithmetic, $8,500 appraised value over 30 years ago, sold by my mother for $3,400 to fund a month in the jungle. The second realization was massive, and it completely shifted something in my chest. My grandfather, who had trusted my mother with his bank accounts, his medical care, and his final days, had quietly moved the documentation of my inheritance out of my mother's house and into mine, hiding it in the one object he made absolutely sure went directly into my hands. The forest always leaves a record, Fiona. She knew. Perhaps not the exact scenario, but she knew her daughter's nature. She had left me a map. From that evening forward, the appraisal card lived in my nurse's bag, zipped securely in the pocket behind my ID badge. I returned to Rainier Vintage the next morning with a complete folder. The notarized will flagged at the specific clause, my grandfather's legal bequest, the 1997 photograph, and the original appraisal card. Silas Ward examined every document. He read through the will twice, and somewhere during the second reading, he stopped being a store owner and became a grandfather. I saw the shift occur in his eyes. This is incredibly thorough documentation, he said. The most complete I've seen in years. Then, he laid the papers down and explained the legal wall, brick by brick. My shop acquired the piece in good faith, with signed consent from the consignor. The buyer purchased it in good faith from us. Washington law requires me to maintain records of both transactions, and that same law prohibits me from disclosing a customer's identity to anyone who walks in with a story, even a very compelling one with evidence. He tapped the leather ledger. The file only opens when there is an official police report number attached to it. That is the key. Without it, my hands are tied. With it, this officially becomes an investigation into the recovery of stolen property, and the gears begin to turn. stolen property. The words were spoken calmly, professionally, but they still landed like a physical blow under my ribs. Because there was only one name on that intake line, and it belonged to my mother. I thanked him and walked toward the exit. I had my hand on the brass door handle when he called out softly, not looking up from his counter. For what it's worth, the gentleman who purchased it, he seemed like lovely people. It went to a good home. I stood on the sidewalk of Harrison Street and assessed my situation with clinical clarity. I knew where the door was. I knew exactly what opened it, and the key had my mother's name etched into the metal. I sat in my car outside the Olympia police precinct for 40 minutes that afternoon. I watched 2 officers carry takeout inside. I watched a detective walk out to his vehicle, sit inside, and stare straight ahead without starting the engine. I rehearsed the sentence in my mind. I want to report a theft, but every single time I reached the part where they would ask for the suspect's name, the words caught in my throat. My phone rang. Rainier Vintage had contacted her that morning to verify the consignment paperwork, a standard procedure. But I was learning that procedure moves with far more speed than courage. I answered the call. "You went back to that shop." Her voice carried a sharp, defensive edge I recognized from my childhood, the tone she used when a retail worker made an error, the voice of a woman who felt deeply wronged. "Fiona, this ends right now. You are embarrassing me in front of local business owners. Family does not behave this way." I sat in my idling car, listening to the woman who had sold my grandfather's legacy to pay for a luxury vacation explain to me what family does and does not do. "Okay, Mom," I said quietly. It wasn't an agreement, though I let her assume it was. Her tone softened instantly. She told me Julian was back, beautifully tanned, and asking about Sunday dinner. She told me she was making the baked salmon, as if the empty glass cabinet in her study had simply vanished from memory. I drove home. I did not file a report. That night, I worked a grueling 12-hour shift. At 4 a.m, we lost a patient, an old hawk with broken wings we had tried for weeks to save. No family arrived in time. I stood in the supply room afterward, and a profound silence settled over me. Not a defeated silence, but something far more resolute. 2 nights later, I cared for a patient in her late 70s, battling severe illness. Terrified in that unique way people get scared when the facility goes quiet at 3 a.m. Her daughter was driving in from Seattle while we waited. She held my hand tightly. Patients often do that with night staff. We are the only family the dark hours provide. She talked to keep her anxiety at bay, telling me about her 3 children. Her oldest handled her bills, managed her medications, and dealt with the insurance companies every single winter. "She handles everything," the woman whispered, her expression growing complex. I don't think I've ever actually thanked her. Not once, properly. You stop seeing the ones who never make you worry." The monitor pulsed steadily in the background. I adjusted her fluids and offered a gentle, reassuring reply. But on my drive home at dawn, her words sat in the passenger seat beside me. "You stop seeing the ones who never make you worry." I had spent 3 weeks believing my mother was the sole problem. One woman, one stubborn doctrine, one paper towel folded in thirds. But sitting at a red light on Harrison Street, I finally saw the larger mechanism at play of family. An entire ecosystem where being low maintenance is simply a slow way of disappearing, and where the loudest demand in the room claims ownership of everything. My grandfather had seen it clearly. Quiet is not the same as gone. I was beginning to realize he hadn't been describing my character. He had been warning me. I asked my mother to meet me at the Timberline Cafe on Highway 101, neutral territory vinyl booths like a demilitarized zone. I laid out my offer before the coffee had even cooled. "Here is what I am asking, Mom. You call Silas Ward, you refund the shop what they paid you. They recover the camera from the buyer, and it comes back to me quietly. You take the financial loss, and I will never speak of this again. Not to you, not to the family. It remains a private mistake. That was the entire proposal. No demands for an apology, no forced confessions in the family chat. Just a door held open at her expense. My mother stirred her coffee for a long, silent minute. Then she looked up, and I watched her weigh the options. I truly believe she wasn't calculating the money, but rather the admission of guilt that lay beneath it. Paying it back meant acknowledging the sale had been wrong. And if this sale was wrong, then a lifetime of silent sacrifices and unfair distributions would have to be reevaluated. She was 61 years old, and she had no interest in that kind of self-reflection. I am not going to sit here and be lectured by my own daughter, she said coldly. It was a piece of metal, Fiona. Your brother was in crisis, and you would let him suffer just to keep an ornament in a cabinet. You would humiliate your own mother over a stone. She placed $3 on the table for her coffee, which she hadn't touched, and walked out. I sat in the booth and finished mine. The door I had held open swung shut without a sound. The ultimatum arrived 2 days later, and true to her pattern, my mother didn't deliver it herself. Aunt Meredith called me on my drive into a shift, her voice dialed into its most sympathetic, maternal frequency. Honey, your mother is absolutely devastated. She wants you to know, and sweetie, I have to agree with her, that if you involve the authorities in this over a private family matter, then you shouldn't bother coming to Thanksgiving or Christmas. She says if you choose strangers in uniforms over your own flesh and blood, then you've made your choice. Those were her exact words. I stood in the sanctuary parking lot, my ID badge in hand, analyzing the design of the trap. My mother had taken the one choice that belonged to me and turned it into an ultimatum. File the report and lose the family. Don't file and lose the camera. But as I looked at that ledger of my life honestly for the first time, I realized they had already taken everything of value. The middle ground I had occupied my entire life. The territory of the good daughter, who keeps everyone comfortable in the hope of someday being seen, had never been real ground at all. Are you listening to me, honey? Meredith asked. I hear you, I replied. And this time there was no attempt to soften the reality. That night, after my shift, I opened my bag, took out the appraisal card, and placed it on the kitchen table. I stared at my grandfather's signature for a long time. Someone in this story had laid the groundwork for me to stand up for myself. It was time I honored that. There was one remaining avenue that didn't require me to walk into a police station, and I forced myself to explore it. I called Silas Ward and asked a direct question. If the buyer were open to selling it back, what would it take? He was incredibly understanding. The piece sold for 5,100 FIO. The buyer is under no legal obligation to return it. If he has grown attached, it might cost more, 5,800. I had that amount sitting in my savings account, specifically earmarked for the roof repairs my cabin desperately needed before winter. 9 years of night differentials, saved dollar by dollar because nobody was coming to catch me if I fell. I sat with my banking app open, my thumb hovering over the transfer button, and my mother's voice echoed in my head. She needed it more. And that is when I finally saw the trap for what it was. If I paid that money, the ledger would look like this. Julian got his jungle vacation. My mother got her copper cookware and her pride intact. And Fiona paid 5,800 of her own hard, earned money to buy back her own inheritance and bury the evidence. The family would call it resolved. They would praise my generosity. It was the ultimate silence fee, the one I had been paying in installments for 25 years, consolidated into one convenient sum. I closed the app. It was never about whether I could afford the money. It was about what that money was purchasing. and I was done buying other people's comfort. The breakthrough came from my cousin Toby. His interest in local history and estate sales had made him friendly with the antique community in the county. One of his contacts mentioned a gentleman who had recently been showing off an exquisite 1938 black paint Leica camera he'd received from his wife for their anniversary. Bought it at Rainier Vintage on Harrison Street. Toby texted me along with a name and address. Arthur Pendleton, retired history professor, living out in Lacey. His text ended with, "Don't make me regret being helpful." I want to be very clear about this. I did not drive to his home. I did not confront an unsuspecting man at his house. I had seen enough of my mother's methods to know exactly how I would not operate. Instead, I wrote a letter. Handwritten, 2 pages. I introduced myself. I explained that the camera he had purchased in good faith had belonged to my grandfather, had been left to me in his legal will, and had been sold without my authorization. I stated that I could document every word and would be grateful for the opportunity to show him the proof at his convenience. I enclosed a copy of the 1997 holiday photo showing my grandfather holding the camera. I mailed it on Tuesday. Wednesday evening, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number, and a warm, elegant voice said, "Is this Fiona? I believe I am holding your grandfather's camera. We met that Saturday at a quiet cafe in Lacey. Arthur Pendleton and his wife Clara. A retired schoolteacher with a kind expression and the protective posture of a woman who had watched her husband get caught up in a complicated situation." I brought the folder. Arthur read the clause in the will, his hand covering his mouth. He held up the appraisal card, matching the hand-drawn diagram of the lens's natural characteristics to the glass resting in his hands, point by point. "I taught high school history for 5 years, Fiona," Clara said softly. "I know the look of a child who has had something precious taken from them. You have that look. Grown up, but it's still there." Arthur began to repack the case right there at the table. I watched him, but Clara placed a gentle hand over his. Her words were entirely fair, and I respected him for them. "We paid $5,800 for this, Fiona. If we simply hand it over, we lose that money. The shop will only make this right once it becomes official. We need a police report, a case number, the proper legal channels. That is how this has to be resolved." And there it was again. The same door, the same lock, the same key with my mother's name on it. Clara walked me to my car. "For what it's worth," she whispered, "I hope you turn that key." That night, sleep evaded me entirely. I sat at my kitchen table and drafted 2 messages I never sent. The first was to my mother, "Mom, please just resolve this. Call Silas Ward. Refund the shop. And I will never mention it again. I just want my family." I stared at the screen, my thumb lingering over the send button. Then I scrolled back through her messages from the past year. It was a long sequence of dinner logistics, forwarded chain messages and coupon codes. Not a single word of apology. Not one. I realized that sending the message wasn't an attempt at connection, it was a surrender. Another payment into an account that had never once yielded interest. I deleted the draft. The second message had no recipient. I typed it into my notes app. "You were 9 years old. You sat on that log and someone chose you out loud on purpose. That is what the camera represents." It was never about the value of the glass. Sitting there in the absolute quiet of my cabin at 3 a.m, I finally confronted the underlying fear I'd been avoiding. I wasn't afraid of losing my mother. I was terrified of proving that the mother I had spent 33 years trying to please had never actually existed. Filing that report wouldn't transform her into someone who would steal from her daughter. It would simply end my lifetime of pretending she wasn't. The next morning, I made a discovery that I must include, because leaving it out would make this story far simpler than the reality, and the truth deserves to be told. I was pulling my copy of the will from the old estate folder, the accordion file my mother had handed to me 2 years ago when she found the administrative work too tedious to manage. As I forced the documents, a small slip of paper slipped from a hidden pocket and drifted onto the table. It was a pawn ticket from Northwest Loan and Silver, dated October 1906, Item 1 Ladies Sapphire Ring, 14 carat, loan amount 450, Memo line as in my mother's tightest handwriting, Wayne, furnace repair. I was 8 years old in 1996, the year of the porch log, the year of the promise. According to family lore, my Uncle Wayne's furnace had died during a brutal freeze, and the money to fix it had mysteriously appeared. I had never once questioned where it came from, because I was a child. My mother had pawned her own mother's sapphire ring, and judging by the lack of any redemption stamp, she had never been able to reclaim it. I sat there, staring at the realization that my mother had spent 28 years with a bare ring finger, a detail I had seen every single day and yet had never truly noticed. This is where she had learned the doctrine. This was the environment that shaped her. Women's heirlooms were the family's emergency fund, and any woman who hesitated to sacrifice her own was deemed selfish. She had sacrificed her own mother's ring first. Understanding where the weapon was forged does not make the wound hurt any less. But I am grateful I found that ticket. It meant that what I did next, I did to the doctrine itself and not just to her. Before I reveal my final choice, let me ask you honestly, you've heard the entire sequence of events now. The will, the ledger, the ultimatum, the pawn ticket from 1996. If you were sitting in that car outside the police precinct with your mother's name waiting to be written on the suspect line, would you sign? Tell me in the comments. Because I will tell you, right up until the pen touched the paper, I wasn't sure I could. On Monday morning, before my shift began, I walked into the Olympia police precinct with my folder. The officer at the desk was named Gomez, mid-40s, reading glasses, possessing the unhurried composure of someone who had seen every variation of human conflict. I recounted the events clearly, chronologically, like giving a medical handoff. He reviewed the copy of the will, the appraisal card, and the detailed diagram of the lens. "This is exceptional documentation," he remarked, "far more than we typically receive." Then we reached the line on the form suspect name. Officer Gomez held the pen out, leaving the space blank. Perhaps he legally couldn't write it for me, or perhaps he was offering me one final moment of choice. The precinct hummed with activity around us. Phones rang, keyboards clacked. I thought of the porch log when I was 9. I thought of the scent of rain and the warmth of Grandfather Arthur's kitchen. Quiet is not the same as gone Fiona. My grandfather had slipped that key under my door, and all that remained was for the quiet daughter to stop confusing silence with peace. I took the pen. In clear block letters, I wrote Helena Mercer, and I signed my name directly beneath it. The old life ended right there, on a printed government form. Officer Gomez stamped the document, the printer whirred, and he handed me my copy. The report number was printed in the upper corner. I had no idea how far that number would travel. Here is what an official report number does. It translates a personal grievance into a legal record, and records move where stories cannot. Silas Ward received the report number that afternoon and opened his ledger to the authorities. The shop contacted the Pendletons, and the legal mechanism began to turn gear by gear, exactly as Arthur had predicted. The transaction was unwound. Rainier Vintage refunded the Pendletons their fine of $800, absorbing the temporary loss rather than facing liability. And the shop's legal recourse for their original $3,400 was now directed entirely at the consignor who had signed the ledger, my mother. I did not orchestrate that outcome. I want that on the record. I never requested it. It is simply the natural consequence of paper being allowed to speak the truth. 10 days after I signed the report, Arthur Pendleton asked me to meet him at Rainier Vintage, in that quiet, polished shop. He placed the leather camera case in my hands. It was the original case, but when I opened it, the 1938 black paint Leica had caught the light exactly as it had for 80 years. "Your grandfather kept beautiful records, Fiona," Arthur said, his eyes glistening. "And so did you. Thank him for both of us." I put the camera strap around my neck for the first time in my life. It rested perfectly against my chest. It fit as though it had been crafted for a promise. Officer Gomez called me later that week with the question I knew was inevitable. The investigation was complete, the property recovered. Did I wish to press formal charges against the named suspect? A theft of that valuation carries significant legal consequences. I stood in my kitchen, looking down at the camera on my chest, and asked him for 48 hours to make my decision. Because there was one final choice to make, and it had nothing to do with a courtroom. My family still knew nothing of the legal resolution. My mother called on Thursday evening. Rainier Vintage had sent her a formal demand letter regarding the $3,400, so she was fully aware of the police report. For the first time in my life, I heard genuine fear in her voice, not regret, but fear. "Fiona, you've made your point," she said, her voice trembling. "You have the camera back. Now, you call that shop and you call that detective, and you tell them this was all a misunderstanding. Tell them to drop the investigation, and we can move past this. Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks. We can go back to how things were." I stood by my kitchen window, looking out at the crooked front gate, and I evaluated her offer. We can go back to how things were. The camera in my possession, the record erased, the family chat filled with holiday plans, and me back in my designated role, the reliable one, the one who handles things, keeping the peace, waiting for the next time someone else needed my boundaries to dissolve. She was offering me my old life at the cost of pretending it had been a fair one. "It was never yours to give, Mom," I said. My voice was entirely calm, the calm of a midnight shift when panic is not an option. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then I opened the family group chat. I uploaded 3 photographs, the consignment ledger showing her signature, the clause in my grandfather's will, and a photo of my hand holding the camera. I added a single line of text. "It was never yours to give. It is home now." I pressed send, placed the phone face down on the counter, and stood in the quiet of the home I had built for myself. For 9 full minutes. The phone remained completely silent. I watched the clock on the stove. I put the kettle on, placed a tea bag in my mug, my hands perfectly steady. The trembling only comes afterward. It always does. When I finally turned the phone over, the chat of 23 people showed no new messages, just the tiny notification indicating that everyone had viewed the photos. Across town, aunts, uncles, and cousins were staring at their screens, processing the ledger signature and the clause of the will. 9 minutes of the most profound silence my family had ever generated. And then the dam broke. The first call was my mother. I let it ring. Then Aunt Meredith. Then my mother again, then Julian, then Meredith, then a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. The phone lit up continuously, the family structure shaking itself apart on my kitchen counter. I sat on the floor, my back against the cabinets, drank my tea, and watched the screen light up, go dark, and light up again. 89 calls in 1 hour. I counted because numbers are clean, and I no longer owed anyone my availability. Toward the end of the hour, my mother left a voicemail. I listened to it once and never again. Though the words are etched in my memory, there was no apology, no mention of grandfather Arthur, no acknowledgement of the will. Just her voice, shaking with a deep, defensive grief, saying, "How could you do this to me, Fiona?" To me. It was the ultimate confirmation of her doctrine, condensed into a single pronoun. I sat on the floor and answered her out loud to the empty room. "You were right, Mom. someone did need it more. You just never once considered it could be me. The phone eventually went quiet. I washed my mug, went to bed, and for the first time in 25 years, the silence in my home belonged entirely to me. The aftermath revealed everyone's true colors. Julian sent a long message the following morning, and to his credit, the first half contained a genuine apology. I should have asked where the money came from, Fiona. I chose not to know. That is on me. The second half outlined a payment plan, $200 a month, until his portion of the trip was repaid. He made 3 payments before his car required maintenance, and the transfers stopped. I expected that, but I kept a record of it anyway. Not to punish him, but because the primary lesson of this experience is that families who keep no records are free to rewrite history, and I no longer reside in that country. Aunt Meredith posted a long, passive-aggressive message in the chat about people who value material possessions over family bonds. I chose not to reply. Meredith wasn't wrong about someone in that chat prioritizing objects over family. She simply had the wrong name in mind. I called Officer Gomez and declined to pursue criminal charges. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't out of weakness or maternal instinct. A criminal prosecution would have put my 61-year-old mother in a courtroom for a behavior pattern she was raised to accept. And a court sentence wouldn't teach her what the letter from Rainier Vintage already had. That the era of silent sacrifices was over, audited, and documented. The record stands, I told Gomez. He made a soft sound of understanding. The sound of an officer who had heard that decision from people who understood the difference between justice and peace. The file remains closed. The property recovered, the suspect named. A permanent record in a city drawer confirming that it happened. She did it, and it was mine. 6 weeks later was Thanksgiving. I did not attend my mother's dinner, and not because anyone barred the door. The ultimatum had quietly dissolved once the family saw the signed consignment ledger. I chose to work the holiday shift instead, the way I had for years when the schedule needed a volunteer. Only this year, I brought fresh wild blackberry cobbler to the break room, baked using the tracking path patience my grandfather had taught me. A traveling nurse told me it was the finest dessert she'd ever tasted, and we laughed until the shift change report. My mother sent a card in December, a simple landscape on the front, written in her elegant cursive. There was no apology inside. I scanned the card the way you check a critical diagnostic report, finding only a single handwritten line beneath the printed message. Families forgive Fiona. I didn't write back, but I didn't discard the card either. I placed it in the hollowed-out book, filed right behind his old tracking notes, directly next to the original appraisal certificate. The proof of the inheritance and the evidence of the doctrine, side by side in the same place. It is my complete inheritance now, and I keep it in perfect order. Arthur Pendleton and I meet for coffee once a month in Lacey. He shares stories from his teaching days, and I bring him fresh apples from the local orchards. His wife, Clara, calls me the investigator with genuine warmth. It is a strange equation a couple of strangers return to me at their own expense, what my own mother took for a profit. I refuse to soften that sentence, because some realities are only true when spoken at full strength. One evening in January, Julian appeared on my porch holding 2 cups of tea. He sat on the cold steps beside me, remaining silent for a long time, which for Julian is a minor miracle. He looked at me, his eyes searching the dark tree line. What was it like, being the one who never fell apart? I looked at my younger brother, his tan long gone, his payment plan abandoned, asking a genuine question. Exhausting. I replied. He nodded slowly, like a student finally realizing the cost of the lesson. We aren't fully repaired, Julian and I, but there is an open door between us now, and it was worth enduring the cold to sit beside it for a while. As for the camera, I keep it in my cabin, secure on a shelf where the morning sun catches the worn brass edges. I still take it out to the woods on my days off, focusing the lens on the quiet details of the forest. My grandfather was correct. In the end, quiet is not the same as gone. It simply means that when the quiet one finally speaks, she only has to say it once. That is my story. One empty leather case, one hidden appraisal card, and 89 calls I chose not to answer. If this story reminded you of a promise someone made to you or one you are keeping for someone else, write it down somewhere safe. Paper preserves what families choose to forget. And if you have ever been the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who handles everything, drop a comment below and share your story with us. Subscribe to their secret stories, and I will see you in our next story.